A single spark can ignite a war. A single move can shatter economies. And in the world of global trade, there is one fragile artery that keeps everything running: the Strait of Hormuz. It begins with a sudden broadcast. Iran announces a blockade. The world holds its breath. Within hours, oil tankers grind to a halt. The vast supertankers carrying millions of barrels of crude are stuck in limbo. Some stranded in the Gulf, others forced to turn back. Markets spiral into chaos. Crude oil prices skyrocket overnight. Gas stations in major cities raise prices by the hour. The stock market teeters and global leaders scramble for emergency talks. The lights flicker in faraway cities. From New York to Tokyo, industry giants warn of looming fuel shortages. Supply chains rupture. Airlines cancel flights, shipping costs explode, and the world economy wobbles on the edge of a disaster. How could a stretch of water, barely 50 kilometers wide, wield such power over the fate of nations? Zoom in on the Persian Gulf. Here, between Iran to the north and the Arabian Peninsula to the south, lies the Strait of Hormuz, the most critical oil choke point on Earth. It's deceptively narrow. At its tightest point, it measures only 50 kilometers across, with just 2 shipping lanes, each a mere 3 kilometers wide. Yet, through this fragile bottleneck flows a 20% of the world's oil supply. The numbers are staggering. Every day, over 20 million barrels of crude oil pass through these waters. That's nearly a third of all seaborne oil trade. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, and Iraq, rely on this route to sell their lifeblood, oil. Even far-off economies like China, Europe, and the US depend on the uninterrupted flow of these tankers. Now imagine the consequences if that flow were cut off. Iran knows this, and that's why, for decades, the Strait of Hormuz has been more than just a trade route. It has been a weapon, a pressure point, and a flashpoint for conflict. But how did this stretch of water become such a battleground? And how has history shaped its role as one of the most dangerous waterways on the planet? The Strait of Hormuz has always been a prize worth fighting for. Long before oil tankers ruled these waters, empires clashed here, each seeking control over this gateway between the Persian Gulf and the open seas. Over 2,000 years ago, the Persians dominated these waters, using them as a vital artery for trade and military expansion. Then came Alexander the Great, marching through the region as he built one of the largest empires in history. Centuries later, the Islamic caliphates held power, turning the Gulf into a hub of commerce. But as the age of exploration dawned, new players arrived, this time from the west. By the early 16th century, the Portuguese navy, armed with superior firepower, seized control of Hormuz, turning it into a fortified outpost. Their grip lasted for over a century before they were pushed out by the rising Persian Safavid Empire, but the strait remained a battleground. The British soon entered the scene, patrolling these waters to secure their trade routes to India. The struggle for dominance never truly stopped. And then, oil changed everything. In the 20th century, as the world became dependent on Middle Eastern oil, Hormuz became more than a historical flashpoint. It became a geopolitical time bomb. The Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s proved just how fragile this passage was. The Tanker War. Between 1984 and 1988, Iran and Iraq targeted oil tankers crossed in the Gulf, each side trying to cripple the other's economy. Hundreds of vessels were attacked. Missiles rained down on shipping lanes. The US Navy was forced to intervene, escorting tankers to prevent economic catastrophe. And that wasn't the last time the world held its breath over Hormuz. In 1988, tensions between Iran and the US exploded. An American warship, the USS Vincennes, mistakenly shot down an Iranian passenger plane, killing 290 civilians. The event nearly escalated into all-out war. From then on, the Strait of Hormuz became a permanent flashpoint, a place where even the smallest spark could trigger chaos. But if history proved anything, it's this. Iran was learning. And in the decades that followed, it built a strategy designed to control, disrupt, and threaten the world's most critical waterway. Today, Iran holds the ultimate trump card. Over the past 40 years, Iran has transformed the Strait of Hormuz into a militarized choke point. It doesn't need to control the waterway, it just needs to make it too dangerous for anyone to use. At the heart of this strategy is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC. Iran's elite force. They don't rely on large warships. Instead, they use speedboats, missile batteries, sea mines, and swarm tactics, designed to cripple tankers, harass navies, and disrupt trade. Iran has rehearsed this scenario for decades. In massive military drills, the IRGC has simulated attacks on shipping convoys, practicing hit-and-run strikes with small, heavily armed boats. They've placed thousands of the underwater mines in key areas, capable of crippling even the largest tankers. And then there are the attacks. 2019. 2 oil tankers, one Japanese, one Norwegian, are struck by explosions. Iran denies involvement, but the world watches nervously. 2021. A commercial ship linked to Israel is attacked by drones in the Gulf of Oman. Again, tensions rise. 2023. The US and Iranian naval forces face off repeatedly, with Iran seizing several tankers and harassing international shipping. Every time the message is clear, Iran has the power to disrupt global trade in an instant. But could Iran truly blockade the Strait of Hormuz? Would they ever push the world to that brink? And if they did, what would happen next? Here's an extended and more immersive version of the final section. Imagine waking up to breaking news. Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz. Oil tankers halted. Global markets in freefall. The first shockwave is instant. Oil prices explode. Within hours, a barrel of crude oil, usually trading at $80, soars past $200. Gas stations from Los Angeles to London. Sea prices spike in real time. Panic buying begins. Drivers rush to fuel up, knowing that tomorrow's price could be double. The headlines grow more dire. Flights canceled as jet fuel prices surge. Shipping costs quadruple overnight. Stock markets crash as energy crisis looms. For price tier, China, Japan, and India. The situation is even worse. These nations import most of their oil from the Persian Gulf, and with the strait blocked, their lifeline is cut off. Factories slow, blackouts spread, and inflation spirals out of control. The European Union scrambles for alternatives, turning to emergency reserves and begging other oil-producing nations to boost output. But there's no easy fix. Even Saudi Arabia and the UAE, the region's biggest exporters, rely on Hormuz to move their oil. Pipelines exist, but they can't transport the 20 million barrels per day that flow through this narrow waterway. The United States feels the tremors next. While it produces much of its own oil, the ripple effect of the crisis crushes global markets. The price of everything, food, transportation, manufacturing, rises. The Federal Reserve faces an impossible choice: raise interest rates to fight inflation, or let the economy spiral into chaos. Then comes the political fallout. World leaders call emergency meetings. The United Nations Security Council convenes in an emergency session. But behind closed doors, the real question isn't diplomacy, it's retaliation. The world is teetering on the brink. And if the blockade isn't lifted soon, war may be the only option. Conclusion and speculation. The warships are already in position. At any given moment, the U.S. Fifth Fleet patrols the waters of the Persian Gulf. Aircraft carriers, destroyers, and submarines, armed and ready. They've been here before. They know the drill. If Iran fully blockades Hormuz, the US and its allies would have little choice but to respond with force. Airstrikes would likely target Iranian naval bases, missile sites, and Revolutionary Guard positions. The Gulf could erupt into a war zone. But here's the dangerous reality. Iran doesn't need to hold the strait. They don't have to face off against the US Navy in a traditional battle. Instead, they could drag the world into a prolonged economic and military standoff, using the same tactics they've honed for decades. swarm attacks with speedboats, overwhelming tankers and military ships, sea mines scattered across vital shipping lanes, making passage too risky, missile strikes from hidden launch sites, capable of targeting vessels from miles away, cyber warfare, crippling the oil infrastructure of rival nations. Iran has studied past conflicts. They've seen what happens when nations go head-to-head with the US in direct warfare. Instead, they operate in the shadows, escalating just enough to gain leverage, but not enough to invite total destruction. And the truth is, this strategy has worked. In 2019, after a series of tanker attacks and rising tensions, global oil prices surged. Iran denied involvement, but the world knew better. The message was clear. We can hurt you without firing a single shot. So, what happens next? The world's economy rests on a knife's edge. If tensions keep rising, if diplomacy fails, if one miscalculation occurs, then the Strait of Hormuz could become the spark that ignites a global conflict. The question is no longer, could it happen? It's, how long before it does? Because in the end, the fate of nations still depends on 50 kilometers of water. And at any moment, it could all come crashing down. The Strait of Hormuz remains a ticking time bomb. What do you think? Are we on the verge of crisis? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more deep dives on